Good evening. Welcome to the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technologies CSINT Conversations. And we're very excited because we have Professor Jon Lindsay visiting with us today, and we're going to be talking about his new book, which I will show you, Information Technology and Military Power. Have a good look. Great book. I'd like to introduce Jon Lindsay first. He is an assistant professor of Digital Media and Global Affairs at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and also has an appointment in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada. Again, today we'll be talking about his most recent book, Information Technology and Military Power, which was published by Cornell University Press in 2020. But Jon has two earlier edited books, beginning with China and Cybersecurity, Espionage Strategy and Politics in the Digital Domain, which came out in 2015, and Cross-Domain Deterrence, Strategy in an Era of Complexity, which came out in 2019. And both of them were published with Oxford University Press. I should probably also tell you that I am Audrey Kurth Cronin. I left that out, the director of the center. Jon Lindsay has a PhD in political science from MIT, a master's in computer science, and a bachelor's in symbolic systems from Stanford University. He served in the US Navy, assigned to Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. Assignments that he may be willing to tell us a little bit about in a few minutes. And I should tell you, Jon, that makes us siblings, because I come from a US Navy family, and my father always said that the Navy is one big family. So I'm glad to know that we're related. Currently, Jon is working on a new book project called Age of Deception, Technology, Intelligence, and Control in International Relations, which I think sounds really interesting, and I can't wait to see the new one. Our plan this evening is for Jon to talk for a short while about the argument in his book, and then he and I will converse a little bit about it, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience, ending the program at about 7 o'clock. So I would encourage you, as you are listening to Professor Lindsay, to enter questions into the Q&A function, because I'll be watching those questions go by and I'll be fielding them when the time comes. So thank you so much for coming, Jon. We're delighted to have you as our guest. We feel truly honored and very excited about your book. And over to you.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Audrey. It is really a privilege to be here. Thanks to you and the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology, which I think has a great acronym, CSINT, since I'll maybe be talking a little bit about intelligence collection and analysis in this talk. And it's particularly a pleasure because, as we'll talk about, this book focuses on what warfighters do with open technologies that are available in the commercial market, how they adapt and reconfigure it to try and improve operations as they understand it. Sometimes it goes well and sometimes it goes not so well. And that really overlaps nicely with work, Audrey, that you've done and has just been published in your own book, which is just terrific. So, so thanks very much. Now, this book has a title which is both very short and maybe overly broad: Information Technology and Military Power. Maybe that's just because I'm not creative enough to come up with something else, but also because it was the simplest way that I could think of to encapsulate the tremendous amount of complexity that the book deals with. And in many ways, the complexity of modern information systems and their interaction with military organizations and the operational environment is the theme that the book is grappling with. So, so the book tries to impose some simplicity, hopefully not simplistic concepts, on this tremendous complexity to understand how people are dealing with this in real time. Now, I'll try and hit on three themes or three contributions that I hope the book makes. One is a negative contribution, and this is a critique of what I'll call the technology theory of victory. Then there's a more positive aim, which is to try and provide a few comments on the micro foundations of military power, if you will. And then thirdly, maybe we can talk a little bit about the methodological approach of the book, which uses ethnographic methods as a way of building understanding in this space. So let's go ahead and start with the negative argument. This is a critique of what I call the technology theory of victory. Now, this is my own name for a general set of ideas that have kicking around out there and been kicking around for decades that hold that better intelligence, more sensors, more precise weapons, and more sophisticated digital networks that tie them all together will make military forces faster, more efficient, and more effective. Now, this general set of claims is most associated with a set of ideas that really emerged in the 1980s, but really are popularized in the 1990s, known as the revolution in military affairs. And it was sort of associated with the American victory in the first Gulf War, the dot-com bubble, and just sort of this heady millennial excitement that we are in a new information economy and therefore should also be in a new military reality. So for example, Admiral William Owens, who did a lot of work to kind of push the US military in this direction, wrote this infamous book called Lifting the Fog of War, in which he argued that technology gives us the ability to see a battlefield as large as Iraq with unprecedented fidelity, comprehension, and timeliness by night or day in any kind of weather all the time. But I think we can all agree that US experience in Iraq over the last 2 decades and Afghanistan have been anything but, right? These have been wars marked by perennial confusion and frustration. They've been long and protracted and have been anything but decisive. So these RMA ideas generated lots and lots of criticism and scholarship, most of it well-deserved. The kind of bottom line of a lot of this work was that it's not the technology, but social factors like doctrine and organization and civil military relations that make the difference. And yet this idea has a perennial attraction, right? So here's the Chinese in 2017. They're talking about artificial intelligence, talking about in the future intelligent battlefield, networks of robots on land, sea, air will be supported by big data and cloud computing that will allow us to acquire data in a useful, orderly, prompt, and accurate manner, which will enable the striking of targets and the evaluation of losses more effectively than ever before. This is echoed as well in kind of US claims. There's a positive version of this that says new technology will make our military stronger. There's a pessimistic version that says the same technology will empower hackers to, at very low cost, strike our digital systems and create all kinds of havoc and destruction. So there are many different varieties of the technology theory of victory, and their historical context changes and the technological vintage changes. But these claims and these great expectations tend to be evergreen, even though you have sort of enduring experiences of fog, friction, right? The way that Clausewitz described the battlefield, friendly fire incidents, targeting errors that kill civilians and cause other tragedies, right? These are also perennial experiences of war, not just in the information age, but particularly in the information age. And it's a little mysterious in that these technologies are often adopted to improve perception and reduce friction, and yet those same technologies often get in the way of seeing. They often create new sources of uncertainty. So part of the book is wanting to highlight this technology theory of victory, which is sort of the gift that keeps on giving, to problematize it a little bit and ask, why is it so enduring, right? Is it just a matter that practitioners are naive? They haven't read enough history. Okay, maybe they need to spend more time at the War College. Are they just cynical, right? Are they trying to sell an organizational theory that will give them more resources and manpower? That's possible, but it may also be possible that there really is something fundamental happening with military power, certain transformations that are going on that we need to pay attention to. And that, I think, brings us to the second more positive object of the book, which is to think about the micro foundations of military power. What do I mean by micro foundations? That's just a fancy social science way of talking about what people are actually doing, what motivates people in their interactions with technologies and with one another to generate military power or to undermine it, and what conditions leads to one outcome or another. Can we understand that by looking at what practitioners actually do? And one goal of the book really is to just kind of call attention to what I call information practice, which is just, intuitively what people actually do with information technology. And if you go into any complex military organization today, you'll find that people are looking at and arguing about representations of the world, right? Digital models, symbols, maps, diagrams, right? Their perception is mediated by technology. You'll also see that that technology is constantly breaking down. There are constant glitches, constant operability problems, problems getting data, constant negotiations and outright arguments amongst organizations about access to data and the meaning of data. So there are constant minor breakdowns and frictions, but you also see constant repair and debugging and working through all of that friction. Some of this involves service members leveraging commercially available technologies to come up with creative solutions and band-aids, and sometimes even more sophisticated creative solutions for dealing with some of these problems. One way to think about this is maybe to repackage the old saw and say that amateurs will talk cyber strategy, but professionals are really debugging information systems. And no matter how sophisticated the engineering, no matter how able the engineers and careful the designs, this kind of ongoing breakdown, friction, and debugging and adaptation is just fundamental to the nature of large-scale complex information systems. Now, I'm not even talking at this point about enemy cyber attacks, if you will. That certainly could be a major source of friction. But I just want to point out that a considerable amount of organizational friction in the information age is self-created. And it is critical that we understand what practitioners are dealing with on a daily basis if you want to go to the next level and understand how cyber operations work and what kind of frictions attackers themselves may be experiencing. Now, this is a bit of a perpetual motion machine, right? Well-meaning attempts to reduce friction often end up creating more friction. Amateur repairs end up being amateurish. They cause security problems and they're not scalable and they're not interoperable. But the managerial reforms that are supposed to prevent those amateurish mistakes end up being really bureaucratized and slowed down by red tape. They don't adapt to changes by the enemy or the technological state of the art. And there's no way out, right? This is one of the big messages here, okay? There is no way out of this problem because continuous breakdown and repair and these cycles of exploitation and reform are just fundamental to the nature of complex digital systems. Now, the book makes two arguments about information practice, because it wants to say, hey, this is constantly going on in organizations, but we would also like to know, hey, under what conditions does it actually improve military performance on the battlefield? And under what conditions does it make mistakes and fratricides and targeting errors more likely? So the first argument I make is that if the performance of, or excuse me, the effectiveness of information practice and its contribution to military effectiveness is not a function purely of technology, but more importantly, it's a function of an interaction between organizations and their environments. And you can think about environments as being more or less structured, right? So environments can have lots of constraints. They can have a set number of things that you are worried about. Organizations likewise can be very institutionalized and formalized. And when you have an organization that fits hand in glove with its environment, then you can have very efficient information practices and systems that are really well aligned with the problem you're trying to solve. At the opposite extreme, maybe you have a very dynamic, fluid, changing problem. In that case, it would be best to have an organization that has a more organic, bottom-up, adaptive way of interacting. That's not going to be the best outcome, but it may be the best you can do under those circumstances, freeing individuals to explore the problem and come up with creative solutions. But then there's these mismatches that are going to be problematic, right? One is going to be when an organization is so set in its ways that it's unable to perceive and adjust to these more dynamic, ambiguous, changing environments. And the other case would be when you have people making all kinds of changes that end up interfering and conflicting with other parts of a more stable, structured environmental problem. So the second argument then is that because you have these four different outcomes, organizations often get caught in a tail chase, right? Whereas they come up with a way to solve one particular problem and they've let out contracts and they've built particular systems, and then lo and behold, the enemy changes, right? Or allies change, or politicians decide they want to do another mission. And suddenly you have an organization that is adapted for one kind of solution, but the problem is different. In that situation, people start defecting from the bureaucratic scheme and they come up with really creative solutions. Unfortunately, those creative solutions cause problems for the organization. Managers move in, they start trying to reform the organization. It becomes more complex. That's good for a little bit, but strategic competition tends to then change the problem yet again. So you go round and around and around where organizations and problems tend to get more and more complex without actually having long-term performance advantages. So that's in a nutshell, the general argument of the book. And it tries to go into detail with a couple of historical and ethnographic cases, which brings me to the third point. And I'll make this really, really briefly so we can get onto the more exciting conversation. This book really draws heavily on ethnographic methods or participant observation methods. Now, these are really common in comparative politics or other parts of the sociology of technology, but they're maybe less widely used in national security studies. And the reasons may be obvious, right? We're dealing with classified information in dangerous environments that are hard to access, with conflicts that are inherently rare events. Okay, so simply getting into the field to observe these things could be difficult. But if you buy my argument that information practice, what people actually do with technology in time of war, is important, then you need to have some ability to actually go and see, what's actually going on. So I was able to leverage my own experience in the United States Navy active duty before defecting to academia, and also as a reservist while I was thinking about this book and the issues that were associated with, and I mobilized to active duty. And I got permission from both the Navy and I was working on a dissertation at the time at MIT, and my advisors thought this was a little strange, but both sides agreed, okay, as long as this doesn't interfere with your actual job, you can go ahead and think about this. And what was interesting is that because I was interested in how information systems worked in complex organizations, and because part of my findings / argument were that practitioners are always having to pay attention to these workings, that the same kinds of questions that I would ask as an academic researcher interested in information practice were very similar kinds of issues that I would deal with as a practitioner, right? Actually dealing with the constant breakdown and repair of systems. In this particular case, systems that were supporting special operations in Western Iraq in 2007 and 2008. So that'll kind of just give you a flavor of where this book is coming from, where the ideas came from, and how I tried to really flesh them out and help you to see this, I think, fundamental problem that exists in all organizations. And I also tried to pair it with a couple of historical cases and other cases that we could see similar issues arising with very, very, very different technologies and different interactions between organizations and the problems that they're trying to solve, but still generating familiar patterns of information practice. So I think I'll go ahead and pause there. And we can take this in whatever direction you and the audience would like to.
Well, great. I would like to exercise my prerogative, as chairs always say, and engage you in a little conversation first. And then I see a bunch of great questions coming in. So I'll be turning to the questions in just a few minutes, audience. So one thing I wanted to ask you, Jon, because my own training has been in a kind of a broader context looking not just at the military level, but also at success as a broader societal question, political, economic, social impact on the outcomes of wars. So is there a tendency, your book says that it's about military, military power. So you're specifically looking at that level of analysis. This is not a criticism. I'm just trying to understand, how do you go from that level of analysis, which is very oriented toward the organization and what it is doing, and it doesn't really talk a lot about what the enemy is doing either, because most of the cases are oriented toward situations where the United States was very dominant. How do you go from that to the question of success in a war? Because a success in a battle is not the same as success in an overall war. And just, managing the practice effectively, adapting effectively, that may work very well for the military organization. But what does that really have to do with the outcome?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this goes back to this question of kind of wrestling with complexity and how really to scope this. I tried to pitch the argument generally enough that information practice and information practice theory could be applicable at a lot of different levels of analysis, and it could be applicable outside the military environment as well. And military operations at the operational level have a feature that is very, very useful for thinking about this particular problem. And that is that it is extreme conflict between extreme cooperators, okay? So you have an organization that ostensibly is working together so that it can defeat or disrupt or degrade, all those wonderful D words, the adversary, okay? So extreme cooperation and extreme competition, and these poles, right, pull on all information processes in kind of two opposite directions. And it creates these two very, very different problems that practitioners are trying to solve at the same time. They're trying to say, hey, I need to understand what's going on in the environment and what's relevant and what our effects going to be and what the unintended consequences are going to be. But then I also need to understand how my organization is cooperating and solving collective action problems that are needed to solve that first order problem. So in the military environment, those are such extreme contrasts that you really see the fundamental tensions of all information practice, which I think manifests in lots of different places, really, really cast in stark relief. So that's one answer. Now, there is this tendency, as you mentioned, kind of in strategic studies, and certainly the way that kind of war colleges like to teach their students, that you can nicely separate the strategic from the operational, from the tactical level. And most historians would hotly contest this, right? They would say, hey, when you're doing operations, right, you're making lots of strategic assumptions, you're designing operations that can work for particular strategies and not others, okay? And so this is really, really a false dichotomy. It works if there is an alignment between strategy and a particular concept of war. Then this engineering optimization problem can proceed, and you can have operational optimization be really, really good for political outcomes. But if you have a mismatch, that can be hugely problematic. So in many ways, this is what the Iraq chapter was about. And it focuses on one particular special operations organization that was run by a Navy SEAL team. And Navy SEALs, you've watched the movie, you've read the books, right? This is a very, very action-oriented organization with a kind of a very proud commando history. And it really wants to see the world in terms of targets that can be actioned. And this was in Anbar province in 2007. So after the awakening, before the surge, in an environment that is transitioning from intensive combat to stabilization and reconstruction, okay? So counterinsurgency and stabilization is arguably the strategic point of being there at that point. And yet you have an organization that was very, very focused on this particular concept of operations. And what was interesting was that these cycles of friction and breakdown, rather than improving the ability of that unit to do counterinsurgency and stabilization, actually tended to further lock in this operational fixation on the find, fix, and finish targeting mission. So this was an example where the nature of the problem at the strategic and the political level had changed, right? It had become something else because, external problems in competitive environments tend to do that. And yet you had an organization that was very, very fixed on optimizing the world as it understood it. And so yeah, there really, really was this disjunction. And you know, a very different case that I look at in the book is the historical case of the Battle of Britain, right? Where like Britain was playing defense. The whole goal was to like stop the strategic bombing campaign, or actually the goal was to keep the Royal Air Force alive as a fighting force long enough for a German seaborne invasion to not be viable. And because that's the strategic goal, the operational goal of identifying and intercepting incoming raids and preserving and husbanding your fighter forces, right, were really, really aligned with the strategic objectives. So in this case, that process of information practice tended to be really, really nicely lined up with the strategic goals.
So the key is to be in fear of your survival, and then the strategy tends to match the operational and tactical practices. It's hard when you're the dominant party in a way. I mean, according to the examples that you give in your book,
Yeah.
I would actually like for you to talk a little bit about Falcon View, because your discussion about bottom-up innovation is very rich. So would you mind telling our audience about that? Because I'd love to ask you a couple of questions about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so this is a case that looks at the 1980s and 1990s practices of automation in primarily, but not exclusively, as we'll see in a second, the aviation community. And the aviation community is interesting because it's full of pilots, and these pilots tend to have engineering backgrounds. And through most of the history of aviation, pilots are responsible for doing their own flight planning. So they would get paper maps, and they would get out grease pencils, and they would kind of draw their routes, and they would file their flight plans, and they would do their calculations on how much fuel this is going to take and where the targets were going to be, and they'd overlay threats and all of this kind of stuff. Like the pilots just did this. So when electronic calculators and PCs started to emerge, like a lot of these guys were like, hey, cool, I can do this, a better way, right? So they start writing their own routines to do flight planning. And this is in the 80s, right? The same time where kind of like Microsoft and Apple are sort of forming out of garages in Silicon Valley. And no kidding, these guys, were basically getting together with their friends, and they even had their wives getting kind of the notice to aviators to put in all the information about weather and flight events and things that were going on into this database. And they would put the database on floppy disks. And as they flew around from airbase to airbase, they would distribute these floppy disks around. And so you kind of had this vibrant bottom-up kind of like garage startup culture happening in the middle of a military bureaucracy. And we're used to that kind of mythical story in the Silicon Valley context, right? Which is often told as this freewheeling kind of alternative to big government and top-down control, of which militaries are sort of the apotheosis of. And yet even there you had kind of this surge of kind of bottom-up activity. And so Falcon View sort of inherited this tradition. And because you had a bunch of aviators that wanted to do this, and in fact, there were aviators that were in the Air National Guard and the reserves, and so they weren't getting the same funding as the active duty Air Force, they got together with a couple of graduate students at Georgia Tech, and they put together this, this basic Windows graphical application. Think of it like Google Maps today, that would run on a PC, and it had to run really fast and really efficiently because PCs were low powered in that day, and you would never do this on Windows, right? You'd always do it on a Unix box. So they created this software that ran fast. It was super popular, and it started to outperform the very expensive Unix-based applications that the program offices were funding. And then so we kind of entered this interesting decade of like back and forth where the program offices said, hey, pilots in the Air Force, and now increasingly in the Navy and the Marine Corps, and it trickled off into special operations and even the ground services. They said, hey, we know you like this, but we can't control it, we can't manage it, we can't deal with the cybersecurity. So we're going to build something better. And they would try and build something better. But meanwhile, the users would keep hacking and reconfiguring and extending this. So this was this very, very interesting moment where like the kind of leading graphical planning application that is used kind of to this day in many places for planning, but certainly, for intelligence analysis, for planning, for special operations planning, is this product of a community of kind of smart hackers that weren't put in that position. They just found a need and decided.
John, your screen has frozen. Jess, I think we're having technical difficulties.
We are having technical difficulties at the moment, and I'm going to try to contact our speaker offline to see if we can get him to at least come in audio. Right now, he is unplugged, and we're going to get him back on. So Audrey, if you could make some general chatter, maybe about the topics he's been talking about.
Sure. Just let me know how things are going.
Great.
So ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry we have a little bit of a break. You know how these things work. This is almost like a live demonstration of why computers and the theory of victory that computational networks will determine success or failure is probably not something we should be depending upon entirely, because here we are. I see some wonderful questions in the Q&A. So I thank you for that. I am not ignoring you by any means. I just would like to have our speaker come back because I'd rather he answer them than mine. I see a good one that's starting out. Has the concept of victory changed? And we will talk about that, questioner. But let's see if we can find our speaker once again and hope that he's dialing back in. The concept of victory is a complicated question because, of course, the question of a military outcome is not the same as the question of a victory in war. And technological determinism is centuries old, and we have to be careful to not to directly draw a line between effectiveness and winning in a war. Effectiveness can win in a battle, but having a good strategy and having it aligned, just as Professor Lindsay was saying, having it aligned with what your organization is doing is absolutely crucial. So I'm sure he'll be right back and talk about this. I have to say that this particular case study on Falcon View is my favorite part of his book. So I hope you were enjoying that. I'm hoping he's going to come back and finish this story, because Professor Lindsay talks about how Falcon View was very insecure, and they had to, in the end, he will tell you this, but in the end they had to put in place a different system because they felt that it was too vulnerable to hacking, and the other system was not nearly as effective. And so what I want to ask him when he comes back, and what I'm hoping we'll begin with, is, what is the policy solution? If you have this wonderful bottom-up innovation, here he comes, good. It'll just be a few more minutes, I hope. But you have this wonderful bottom-up innovation, and you have to have security. There you are.
Can you hear me?
I can, and I was just doing a little tap dancing, talking about how much I love your Falcon View case study. So I'm sorry that somehow the system went down, but it sort of is a real-time example of why we can't just depend upon computational systems for victory, right?
That's true. The book develops this idea of information friction, and so this is the performative dance example of that.
And look how well you've adapted. So adaptive innovation there, John. So may I ask you, if you don't mind, if you can manage, I think you must be using your phone, huh?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you start? We lost you when you were getting to the meaty part about the Falcon View system and how it was showing itself to be too vulnerable. So if you could pick up that story there, I think we'd love to hear the rest of it.
Okay, sure. So Falcon View was very popular throughout the Air Force, and at this time it had developed acolytes and fans throughout the Navy. But people, the program offices in particular, were very, very concerned that this effort was ultimately not going to be scalable or supportable. And there would be some applications that you really wouldn't want users tinkering around with, right? So safety of flight, weapons release, functions, all of these sorts of things that, a large-scale planning system would also interface with. So the idea was, okay, we need to shut this down, but we know that it's popular with users. And one thing that was very interesting is that, so this kind of story, there are little versions of this that happen all over the place. Usually the bureaucracy wins, right? It's easy to say, hey, Lieutenant, that is a neat little hobby shop project you have, but it doesn't meet these different, requirements, or it breaks these regulations. We're going to pull it off the network. But several Falcon View proponents actually got themselves working in the program offices. And this was interesting in that they were working both sides. They were both kind of keeping this project alive as a stopgap until the larger systems could provide this functionality, and trying to create the same systems that were going to replace it. So while it was really easy to kind of have this morality tale of, wonderful, adaptive, live user innovation efforts versus the slow, ponderous systems bureaucracy, in reality, you had this more complicated symbiosis where there was top cover for user innovation efforts, and an attempt to try and build that on a more stable platform that would leave it open to users to come up with new applications, extensions, and customizations without then kind of interfering with its large-scale stability and sustainability. What was interesting is that there are at least two cycles that this went through, where there was a large system that was designed to replace Falcon View, and by the time it came out, Falcon View had already moved beyond. That system struggled to meet the requirements that had been specified 2 or 3 years earlier, and already requirements had changed as warfighters went out and explored new possibilities and new functions and dealt with new requirements, because let's face it, the US was kind of a hyperactive superpower in the 1990s, and that's tended to put people into contact with slightly new data processing problems that they needed to interact with.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I'm grateful to you for finishing that story. I'm sure that our audience will have questions about it. And we have about 50 minutes and a lot of great questions already. So if it's all right with you, Jon, I'm going to turn to their questions. Okay? All
Okay,
right,
great.
let's start with Christopher Basson. And he asks, has the concept of victory changed as a result of the use of information technology by military organizations?
So, the concept of victory is really, really fraught in military effectiveness studies. And I think this really came up in the conversation we were having about, do you mean victory at the political level, where you actually accomplish your objectives, within an acceptable level of cost, whether it be human cost or financial cost or other political opportunities? We're going to speak more narrowly about keeping the other military organization from doing what it wants, or destroying that other organization, or occupying territory. I think even that very concept, kind of at the strategic political level, really kind of varies depending on the conflict that you're looking at, right? This kind of takes us back to kind of Clausewitz 101, right? Understand the kind of conflict that you're involved in, because whether it's a total war of annihilation, or whether it's just an armed reconnaissance, you're going to organize strategy differently to deal with it. So I guess I'm going to dodge that question a little bit. And I wanted to focus on information practice, because I think no matter how you define victory, you're going to have to figure out what kinds of things matter in the world, figure out where your own forces are, figure out how to get your forces into contact with those, or avoid contact if you're playing defense or trying to be stealthy, right? So there are going to be kind of these operational problems that you're going to need to solve. Those don't add up to victory, but they may add up to some degree of operational effectiveness. Now, maybe your larger question is and the person didn't ask this, but I'll just maybe kind of guess a little bit. If you're talking about different kinds of conflicts that we're now thinking about in terms of cybersecurity, cyber operations, cyber warfare, right? That looks like a totally different set of interactions than kind of the traditional clash of arms on the battlefield. And so if there are no militaries involved at all, then what meaning could military victory even have? Certainly the cyber influence interaction between, Russia wants to sway an election and cybersecurity professionals want to prevent that, right? That is a very, very different conversation than what would be happening otherwise. And that's actually one reason why I decided to pull the entire cyber conflict discussion out of this book altogether and have, a larger conversation about it. But I think no matter what kind of political interaction you're looking at, information practice itself is going to either help or hinder it, hopefully in the way that I described. That's what I
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a great point. So Jon, did you have a big part of this book that you pulled out of it?
I did, right? So, it may seem strange that the book is called Information Technology and Military Power, and yet there is very little discussion, in fact, no discussion of cyber conflict, which is probably the greatest manifestation of information technology and military power in the 21st century, right? We have this entire new domain of conflict. We've got new military organizations, a 4-star unified command in the United States that can manage cyber warfare. Every joint task force now has a cyber component commander. So how the heck could I possibly leave that out, right? And so, I had originally written up something about this, but the key point that I think makes cyber conflict different and in many ways more complex, although not necessarily more dangerous, and that's an important point, is that in the classic military case, you have two feuding organizations, and each of them have a command and control system. They have intelligence sources, they have to integrate it, they have to communicate with all of their people, and it may be very, very complex and distributed. But at the end of the day, each side largely controls its own stuff. And that's different from the cyber case where you have common tools, common networks, common protocols, right? Both competitors are interacting in the same organization. And that's very interesting because now you have a strategic conflict between, in a very real sense, members of the same organization. So while I think that we can think about information practice as an input and a constraint on cyber conflict, that makes it more complex because cyber conflict, right, is both targeting and protecting, exploiting, undermining, reinforcing information practice itself. So I thought it was important first to up and say, well, what's going on inside of organizations to begin with, right? In the best of situations, when people are ostensibly working together, what kinds of frictions and breakdowns are they encountering? And then later on, we can add in, now what happens when you're actually sharing an organization with your adversary, when your adversary is a source of the frictions that you are dealing with in the information systems itself.
Fascinating. And I think my co-director, Josh, as you know well, Jon, would probably say that it's all about espionage, right? But I'll give Josh his own ability to talk. I think he has a question up here in a minute. Okay.
By the way, let me just check technical. I noticed my internet has recovered. I unplugged my router and put it back in. If the sound and everything is okay, we'll just continue this. Otherwise, I could go back to the other one. What do you prefer?
I think it's okay. And
okay,
so
good.
If you don't mind, I mean, the visual isn't quite as good as it was before, but it's good. So we're fine with it if you're fine with it.
Okay.
All right. So next question from Scott Crawl. Wait a second. Now I'm having problems. Okay. How much autonomy do you think the DoD will give to AI-based management systems in the everyday analysis and decision-making at the Pentagon? And how will that impact human employment at the Pentagon? So here, the big looming question of AI.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. So maybe to back up and contextualize, I think the AI conversation that we're having today is definitely a new manifestation of this tendency that I was talking about as the technology theory of victory, the idea that you will be able to have information technologies that substitute for what militaries are doing, and will be able to do it so quickly and efficiently that you have a radical step function change in military performance. So there is a real rhyming familiarity in the way that we talk about AI, and I would say
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Now, the robust finding in the kind of economics and organizational sociology of information technology is that these technologies are never pure substitutes. While they can substitute for some functions, they also end up generating all kinds of new tasks and positions or complements that are needed to manage those informational interactions. So the more you add in information technology to try and substitute for what you already understand what you're doing in order to improve your performance, the more you start creating this overhead of kind of complementary kind of human interactions. And I think that we are going to see, and we are seeing exactly that happening with AI, right? AI is not a pure substitute for human decision making. It can do some things well, right? It can provide predictions when you have lots and lots of really good data about fairly well understood problems. And that's not the operational warfighting problem where you have terrible partial fragmentary data about ambiguous evolving problems. So AI in that situation is going to create a huge demand for human complements, for human interactions, for people that can interact with and debug these systems. So I think that in all our talk about where do we give AI autonomy and should we be concerned about killer robots and where do we put the man in the loop, is kind of losing sight of this very, very pragmatic fact that organizational complexity is going to increase, and that complexity cannot just be automated away with AI, because AI is going to be part of what's driving this more intensive interaction. But it will tend to pull people more and more into this information processing, debugging, and sense-making role that makes judgment really, really complicated. And the questions that you were asking before, Audrey, about like how do we disentangle strategy and politics, like AI is going to amplify exactly that, right? I mean, like that's the key complement is why are you doing what you're doing? And that's going to become more ambiguous and more distributed throughout the force in the society, right? So there'll be kind of this change maybe in the way that you're thinking about conflict, precisely because these are not substituting technologies.
That's very thought-provoking. Wonderful. Okay, let's see. Catherine Urban. We've heard a lot lately about the prospect for public-private partnerships to develop cutting-edge military technology. She wants to know about the different organizational cultures between the Pentagon and Silicon Valley, and how can that work?
Yeah. This is definitely real, right? So this is kind of what I was getting at with the Falcon View story. There, on the one hand, the stereotype is absolutely true, right? Silicon Valley wants to move fast and break things, and it's got all of these people that are starting things up and attracting venture capital and making things move at internet speed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a little bit of a stereotype because some things in Silicon Valley actually don't move very quickly, and some things do get locked in and are a little bit resistant to change. But okay, that's there. And then there's this story of military bureaucracies as kind of these ponderous beasts that have to write up these requirements, and they have to then, deconflict them, and they have to go through all this committee process. And everybody likes to make fun of this defense acquisition chart that maybe some of you have seen, which is just this incredibly painful, research, development, test, and evaluation process you have to go through to invent weapons. Okay, so like, how the heck could you possibly put those together? And what I was trying to argue with the Falcon View piece is that actually it's more complicated. You see this ferment of innovation already happening within military organizations, but not necessarily formally blessed and sanctioned by military organizations. And you don't have to spend much time in a military organization or start reading for this before you start to see example after example of somebody that came up with a way of using a drone in their iPhone in some creative way, or a unit that solved some problem that their command and control systems administrators weren't able to solve, on and on and on. So this is a very, very kind of typical problem. So maybe the distance between these two cultures is not as great as we actually think it is, except that these public-private partnerships, I think, too rarely are actually really focusing on that ferment of innovation itself. There's still this idea that we're going to tap Silicon Valley for its innovative potential to come up with the new technology in this widget. And then we're going to throw it over the transom, and then the military will implement and operationalize it. And that's a little bit backwards, right? If we thought of this as less of a technology problem, more of an organizational problem, then the question would be, well, how do you make sure that that technical expertise is forward, right? That the technical expertise that is already forward is supported, right? That they have the ability to adapt and innovate, and those adaptations and innovations are being kind of folded back into existing, command and control systems. That'd be a very, very different approach to, I think, public-private partnership that would focus on the people less than the technology. Because, again, like, you don't ever get the command and control system working the way that you would like it to. It is perpetually in a state of breakdown, right? And so, so attending to that repair, I think, is going to be an inherent part of increasing military capability in this more complex environment.
Great. Okay. Actually, on that point, I'm always arguing with my friends that the military promotion system that keeps people in vertically is so 19th century. It's going to be very difficult to be able to be that agile until we fix that. All right, let's go to Josh Rovner. He says he's interested in the implications of the argument for civil-military relations. Should civilians take a hands-off approach, given that the modern battlefield is information dense and full of fast-moving, unstructured problems?
Yeah, well, okay, so my first answer is no, definitely not. In fact, I would think exactly the opposite, right? The battlefield is sometimes full of really fast-moving problems. That doesn't necessarily mean they're fast-moving problems that are problems that strategically you want to really, really solve. We talked about militaries that solve these quickly moving problems, but end up solving them in a way that's strategically inimical to what you want to accomplish politically. You could certainly tell yourself stories in a China scenario, right, where you freed the military to innovate in a very, very aggressive way that ended up starting to build in some escalatory risks with the Chinese, and especially with kind of Chinese conventional and military systems that may or may not share command and control systems, et cetera, et cetera. Those are exactly the situations where you kind of would want civilians deeply embedded with those interactions to understand what kind of the tactical consequences might be. I think the larger question here is that this larger historical trend that we're starting to discuss, which in the book I call the informational turn in military practice, which is this shift from military practitioners being, on the battlefield, physically fighting in the mud and on deck plates, washed by the ocean, right, to living in these remote command and control spaces where they're still frustrated and dealing with lots and lots of things, but they're physically removed from the pointy end of the spear, which is increasingly automated, right? And so these organizations get more and more complex, which means that the content of military labor actually is becoming more and more civilianized, right? What do military practitioners do? Well, they work in offices and they go to video teleconferences and they work on reports and build PowerPoint briefs and, write Word documents, right? I mean, like, it is very, very similar to what's happening in the civilian world, but it's connected to these fast-moving parts. So you have kind of military practitioners that are more and more involved in civilian-type tasks, doing things that are so leveraged because of that automation link to the pointy end, which means that they're going to be more and more politically consequential. So I think this speaks to needing to have kind of a robust two-way conversation. If anything, I think one implication would be, a strong endorsement of the Elliott Cohen view of civil-military relations, where you should have a robust conversation between politicians that are really, really sensitive to objectives and competing political trade-offs, and military professionals that understand the tactics, because those tactics have political consequences, and they're going to be different political objectives that they're trying to meet. So
That makes sense. Okay, I'm going to give you two questions and I'll paraphrase them, but I want to make sure we get there are a lot of questions here and I want to make sure we get as many in as we want. You can answer whatever aspects you want, John.
Okay.
The first one, has the United States learned from Iraq and Afghanistan that it requires a shift in information systems, or do many of the bad habits of the RMA framework still linger? So that's question A. Hold that for a moment. And then from one of our PhD students, ethnographic studies, as you mentioned, aren't all that common with respect to national security and technology. Do you think your work opens up more avenues to such research? And how do you go about writing up the final draft, balancing the possible classification issues with telling an accurate empirical story? You can tell that he has some connection to the military.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, the first one, which was, does military culture, and I think the question was specifically about Army culture, does it just sort of persist throughout these conflicts, or are there changes? Am I getting that right? Okay. One thing that I think is well, there's many things that are managed, but one aspect of these wars and the conversation about technology that's been very, very interesting is that there was sort of this morality tale that emerged that the RMA was all about network-centric operations, and then we found ourselves in this population-centric fight, and the attempt to apply network-centric warfare to a population-centric counterinsurgency was a terrible idea, right? And you were looking at networks, but the real networks were the social networks. And by not understanding that, we ended up getting ourselves into a terrible mess. And it took, many, many years of reform until we finally, figured out counterinsurgency theory and we surged and yada, yada, yada. Okay, that's true to an extent. But what's interesting is that in the process of learning how to do counterinsurgency, the U.S. military had a voracious appetite for new technologies. And there was massive kind of sustaining low-level innovation where they figured out all kinds of different ways to, yes, do the targeting mission, but also to do population surveys and also to do social network analysis and also to figure out, the relationship between, economic performance and small grants and military violence levels. Okay, so you had kind of technology being applied across the board. So that morality tale really was too simplistic, right? It wasn't that technology is only good in one place and not good. No, technology can be used in a lot of different places, even when a military is now having to look in a very, very different direction. That said, I do think that kind of, deep in their DNA, military organizations do have kind of styles or types of wars that really accord with their, core identity and are probably embedded deep in their history. Right? So scholars like Austin Long make this argument. And I certainly found this with kind of the Navy SEAL team that I was focusing on, right? That there was just such a strong kind of historically based identity that really, really shaped the way that they were going to be innovating and therefore perceiving and interaction and influencing the battlefield. So I tried to tease this out a little bit by, in AMBAR comparing the Special Operations Task Force that I was with Marine Corps units in the same battle space that were also innovating with technology, but doing it in a very, very different way. They had a much more kind of population policing mentality that they brought to it rather than kind of the Navy SEAL counterterrorism mentality. And I also tried to compare it, even though this is very, very hard to do with open sources, compared it with the JSOC mission, which is a much more highly resourced version of counterterrorism. And you could argue that both of those alternatives had a fair degree of success in their local scoped operational mission, whereas the organization that I was looking at kind of did both of them poorly. Now to the second methods question, right? That is a fantastic one. Ethnographic methods are very, very different than the kind of KKV, causal inference, things that we learn about in our normal political science education, right? Where, you come up with a deductive theory and then you go and get some data and you make sure you pick it on the independent, not the dependent variables, and all these sorts of things. Whereas every single ethnography that you read has this weird idiosyncratic story about how the researcher happened upon, got involved with, developed the trust of this community that they were working with. And, they developed this very, very kind of seemingly narrow story about often kind of a historically insignificant case, and yet done with a mind of trying to say something broader about culture, about social practices. So I think there's kind of two different questions here. One is, how is that even possible? Like, how can you trust anything an ethnographer says, given that their access to this group is so circumstantial and so highly personalized, right? In my case, right, I happen to be a reservist that had access to this particular unit. They were copacetic with me, doing this and this, that, and the other thing. I had been steeped in while I was in active duty, I had been tinkering with and developing some Falcon View applications myself. So that meant that I was able to develop some trust with developers and program managers, that went on. So like a very, very personalized and particular story. Like, why should you trust anything that I have to say? And I think the answer is that ethnography tends to work in this more sort of Bayesian conversation, if you will, with the literature, where you're like, this is what lots of people have said about organizations. This is the experience that I have. Does it make sense? If not, what do we need to update? Do we go back? And you go back and forth between this very, very richly described casework and this very, very general theory to try and get theory that stabilizes to the point that it can then be applicable for understanding other similarly richly described cases. And so, that's kind of where you get to the point where you're like, okay, I'm now through this very particular experience that I have, recognizing kind of enduring patterns that seem to emerge in lots of other different places. So I think that ethnography is less of a theory testing than a theory generation mechanism that gives you some confidence that what you're seeing may make sense. And so what I tried to do was use this as a way of kind of laying out this more general theory, which then I think would have kind of implications that you could go and test. Now, as far as like doing this in the military, again, like it worked in this case, but it was so difficult and so frustrating that I finished my dissertation, put it aside, and worked on cyber conflict and cyber warfare for the next 6 or 7 years because I wasn't sure kind of how to bring this back into the realm of security studies and make it fit better with other theories. So that's kind of a cautionary tale on like, if you go down this road, right, it is weird and strange and different, and it may not actually fit really well with kind of the discourse and conversation that people are used to having about testing and evaluating theories about kind of security. As far as the classification realms, that's a great question. Okay, so part of the deal with this was, hey, if you're going to write about naval special warfare in a combat environment, then yeah, your manuscript is going to have to be reviewed, and it was, and they found nothing wrong with it. Although they didn't like my conclusions, there was nothing classified about it. But part of that is because I specifically was interested in things that were tacit, that were cultural, that were not being explicitly written down, right? Things that are explicitly written down are the things that are explicitly classified, right? Those are the categories of information that get embargoed for 10 or 25 years. But I was more interested in kind of how people were making sense of the world, right? Exactly the things that didn't get written down. So it was kind of that kind of, more general but slightly abstracted work that I was looking at. And I kind of found this sweet spot where I could be in a classified environment and yet describe kind of more general tacit organizational interactions that were general enough that they didn't kind of like run afoul of the classification authorities.
How interesting. Jon, one thing that is happening is that your hand is wiggling and it's making me a little dizzy when you talk. So
I'm sorry.
Set it on something. Otherwise we can see you. Yeah, that's better. Can I also just say, the calling this targeting approach counterterrorism has always driven me crazy. Not you. I mean, that the way that is the case in the military, because what the Marines were doing, that kind of practical house-to-house understanding of collecting information and data, that's closer to traditional counterterrorism that integrates a lot of different types of information and capabilities rather than just targeting. So, oh, there you are. Oh, good. You're back. Okay, good. Can you hear us?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, that is a little bit better. All right. Well, thanks, John. Let's keep going. We have another one of our wonderful PhD students. His name is Ian as well, Ian Campbell. And let me see, get to the meat of this question. Did you find certain organizational and doctrinal practices and structures are more effective in dealing with friction associated with competition, either in conventional wartime situations or even in gray zone scenarios? For example, do flatter or more hierarchical organizations perform better in different situations? Thank you.
Yeah,
That's a
okay.
complicated question. Can you generalize on that? I'm not sure I could.
Yeah, let me, your previous comment, I definitely wanted to pick up on, because I think it's so important. You're absolutely right, right? I mean, like, when special operations says counterterrorism, they mean find, fix, finish, evaluate, assess, and it's this, endless tail chase where you're constantly picking up low-level people and you're interrogating them, or with drones, you're not doing that, right? And it's kind of an endless algorithm, right? And maybe it generates more recruiting material, right? So, I mean, this is a problem that never kind of comes to an end. It was exactly that tension that I was kind of really interested in AMBAR, because, the things that generated the willingness of people there to work with Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004, 2005, or to turn against that same organization in 2000.
And the rise of ISIS, I would argue, later.
Yeah, exactly.
Role.
Yeah. That was much more embedded, right, within kind of some very interesting economic and social dynamics between, who controlled the underground smuggling economy and what was the political prospects of these kind of Bedouin tribes with kind of the rising Shia-dominated regime in Baghdad, right? This kind of had very little to do with kind of the viability of kind of AQI, and much more to do with these kind of like very interesting local calculations. And what was interesting is that like this special operations unit was kind of embedded in that society, was talking to a lot of people, but and a lot of those conversations were potentially very useful for understanding those kind of broader social and political motivations, but it tended to filter them all out in its zeal to find kind of actionable targeting information. Yeah. On the other one, I think, the one high level implication of this work is that there is no one size fits all solution for all military problems, nor could there possibly be, right? I mean, war is inherently a competitive problem, which means both sides are incentivized to change the problems, to hide from the other's sensors, to do things in surprising ways, to expand operations in an unexpected theater or a particular line of operations. Okay, so like surprise is sort of built into the competitive dynamic, but getting really good means you're having to focus on a particular set of structures. And the US military has tried to say like, well, is there some kind of meta structure that you can come up with? And the best that we've been able to come up with is, mission-based, orders in all of its different, varietals, right? So the combined arms mode of like, let's have really clear orders and common doctrine and communication procedures, but then let soldiers maneuver on their own and solve things the best that they can in their local circumstances. But all this does is kind of punt the question of like, well, where do you really draw that boundary? Because if you need everybody having a common mission, you need everybody communicating in the same way. What do you do when there's ambiguity and politicization in the definition of the mission? What do you do when your communication protocols are actively evolving because you're bringing new technologies and new organizations in that need to communicate in a different way? So, you've kind of got this kind of constant balance between top-down and bottom-up processes that you are having to work out as you learn the nature of the problem. So, I think there are going to be some problems, and I argue that nuclear deterrence would be one of them, where you really do want kind of top-down command and control, because the price of making mistakes in the nuclear realm is horrific, right? It's the annihilation of a city, okay? In a kind of more kind of low end protracted gray zone type conflict, then maybe a bottom up mode of exploration and adaptation and performance improvement is going to be better. But the constraint there is, as we were just talking about with the find, fix, finish algorithm, that is something that can kind of go on and on forever, right? It's a recipe for protraction. It's a recipe for, burning your resources ad infinitum. Okay, so, again, like I think that because there is no one information practice for information technology, it's always going to bring us back to the strategic concept. This is just magnifying those fundamental tensions that have always been there.
Yeah. I'm glad you talked about counterterrorism, because that's something that I think our reliance upon decapitation, capturing or killing, has just taken over so much of what was our strategic thinking, and it's very alarming. All right, I must give others a chance. Here's a question about how you get participant data from the military. What do you use? Operational reports from headquarters or surveys of participants, after action reviews? What does your raw data look like? Steve Brenner is asking.
Yeah, okay, great question. So I think there's a couple of different ways to approach this. One would be, ethnography encompasses a lot of different methods. Okay, so one could be totally interview and document based. Okay, which means you're interested in a particular operation or a particular phenomena, and you start talking to people, and they refer you to other people, and they give you some kind of unclassified documents, and you start building up an understanding of how that works. And that's kind of the way that I think a lot of us are doing intuitive kind of historical cases. And the Falcon View case was very much that kind of ethnographic case study. There could be war games and operations where you bring in academics, or the military has some of its own ethnographers, and you're being able to watch and observe things as they're happening. But in this sense, there's this real kind of strong division of labor between the ethnographer and what's actually going on. Now, in a military situation and classified data and operational context, that's probably not going to be an option. What I did in the literature would be called autoethnography, right? And that means where you're really kind of using yourself as the instrument, right? And using your own participation in that organization to surface and generate data, right? So throughout my deployment, right, like every staff officer does, I kept these kind of little green notebooks, and I was constantly scribbling in them, right? And I was scribbling in with kind of whatever I happened to be working on, right? I was working on some kind of, humanitarian kind of well digging project out in, Fallujah somewhere. I'd kind of be writing about all the people that I was meeting and what they were talking about, and kind of the information technology issues that would enable that. And I think I would have been doing that even if I didn't have in the back of my mind that I was going to write this up someday. Right. So you come back from war with all of these notebooks, and then you kind of spend some time like reading them and buffing them out and trying to figure out like, okay, with these different theoretical frameworks, how do we, make sense of that? What am I missing? You can maybe then use that to kind of go back to other people that were there in the same organization and have some sort of follow-up questions. So, one extreme, you're totally on the outside, you're just doing interviews. You can then be a little bit more immersed. That's traditional ethnography, hard to do in a combat situation. There's what I did, which was like actually, put on a uniform and mobilize and spend some time with this organization. And then you've got all of the kind of restrictions that we talked about with data before. And if you really were interested in something where kind of the content of operations really, really mattered, then maybe like that would be a more difficult prospect.
And you were responsible for doing your own job. So it wasn't like you could sit back and just have a survey and watch everyone fill out or participate.
No. So I mean, like I made, and I mean, this is kind of part of the conversation that I had with, commanding officer, as well as kind of my academic community, was that, hey, I'm going to be participant first and observer second. I mean, that is completely secondary, right? But because I had a sense from my prior active duty time that this basic phenomena of kind of breakdown and repair and kind of organizational negotiation was just part of the warp and woof of what staff officers are doing on a daily basis, I kind of knew like, okay, like we just need to be able to kind of go into an organization and kind of keep track of the kind of things I would be dealing with anyway, but just doing it in a more explicit way that would be available for recall later on. So yeah, here, let me highlight one point of potential bias, right? And like ethnography, like you got to be really, really clear that like you have human beings that are collecting this data, right? My job was to be the non-lethal effects officer with a special operations task force that was manned by a Navy SEAL team. Okay,
Yeah.
what does that mean, right? It means my job was civil affairs and information operations and women's engagement and like all of these non-kinetic operations that I like to describe as things SEALs don't like to do. Okay, so like I was kind of going around Ambar saying like, hey, there may be other ways other than a raid or something else to do this. And that was a very, very difficult, thing to sell. Okay, so, part of the tribal engagement mission, right? Tribal engagement, let's engage the tribes in Western Iraq. Well, the real tribal engagement problem was trying to get kind of different parts of the SEALs and the Marine Corps and other parts of the special operations community, like interacting and talking to each other and thinking about these kind of alternative points of view. Now, so I would certainly be open to the concern that, well, maybe you had a biased perspective in that, you were kind of looking at this mission, which was inherently frustrating and under-resourced in the organization in which you were embedded. And that's true. But at the same time, it put me in this very interesting place where there was a great deal of tension and frustration. And if you want to kind of do interesting ethnography or interesting history, right, follow the crises, right? Because it's where things are in tension that you start to see kind of the interesting structures and preferences start to emerge. So, I think it was precisely the potential for bias made this an interesting vantage point to kind of surface these tensions that were really interesting.
That's very interesting, John. So have you had any reactions from the Marines? Because when I read your book, I was thinking, wow, the Marines would love this. Have you had any kind of feedback from Marines?
Not, I don't think I've had any explicit feedback from Marines.
I'm going to give
I've
it
had
to some
very,
Marines and tell them to read it and write to you.
Yes. Okay. Well, please send some Marine feedback. I've had some very mixed feedback from SEALs, as you can imagine.
Well, you're a little critical about the strict, their main function as they see it, which is targeting. So
yeah, and as we've all been reading the news the last couple of years, I mean, this community has been dealing with some serious command climate issues, right? The multiple war crimes trials and kind of, disciplinary problems within the community. Those were horrifying and tragic, but at the same time, I was not totally surprised given the culture that I, become really familiar with.
Here's where we get to the point I was trying to make in the beginning, which is that I think that it was a strategic problem.
Yeah.
We wanted to have a cheap way to engage in these areas in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially Iraq. And we used targeting and small operations, special operations as a lower cost way to do it. And the whole counterterrorism policy became extremely distorted. And, in some respects, the SEALs were the ones who paid that price. Their high ops tempo. And I'm not going to accuse anybody. I'm sorry, I'm not going to excuse anybody that was engaged in war crimes. Don't get me wrong. Not by a mile. But anyway, it's a problem our country has. Right. So there are a lot of very long questions, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to be able to read all of the questions, but I will summarize. There's 3 of them together I will give you. The first one is basically there's so much pejorative talk about the RMA as on the basis of the Gulf War. So what went right? Did anything go right? And the second one, how do we measure military effectiveness in this new technological environment, since we have new kinds of capabilities, both material and non-material? So that's the second one. And then the last one, which is somewhat related, is how can military organizations determine if their information systems are going to work well or not if they're not actually engaged in war?
Yeah, great. So on the first one, what went right with the RMA? I think quite a lot went right with it. When I critique the technology theory of victory, I don't just say, hey, this is all a bunch of hooey and people are confused and war is just constantly full of fog and friction and has been, forever. Part of the reason that these expectations keep coming around with every single generation of technology is that improvement is possible. small units are able to do things today that in a previous day would have taken much larger units, right? So kind of on these kind of narrow tactical and operational metrics, you have incredible improvements, all right? So it would be silly to say that that isn't the case. What doesn't happen is that you don't get these kind of step function improvements in efficiency and effectiveness and decisiveness, all right? In fact, you often have kind of exactly the opposite happens. And I think from kind of a theory of war perspective, that's not necessarily surprising, okay? The enemy is not going to challenge an organization in an area that it knows that it's very, very good. It's going to find somewhere else. If you have a conflict that is kind of first order evidence that there is something that is not well understood about the balance of power and capabilities and resolve, okay? So getting good at something just creates the incentives for conflict to go in other places. So I think the problem is not that the technology theory of victory is wrong in any absolute sense. It's that it's highly conditional on organizational and strategic conditions. And so this is kind of really a call to sort of attend to those cultural and political aspects that are kind of determining the performance of information systems. Yeah, so I think kind of from a tactical level, like there's a ton of stuff that has gone right, that continues to go right. That little story that I just told about kind of the network-centric revolution continuing throughout the population-centric operations of Iraq, right? That would be another example, okay? Audrey, you and I were kind of bemoaning the tragedy of soft-based counterterrorism, and strategically it is a problem, but from an operational perspective, right, it was a big part of the story of defeating, or at least temporarily, suppressing Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who then, comes back even worse as ISIS. So like, I totally get, like, strategically this is a problem, but I just want to make the point that, like, well, this was a network-centric technological innovation that in many ways you would count it as an RMA success. But from the long-term perspective, like, there's some huge strategic concerns because it made it seem like, oh, okay, like we've got this thing licked, without paying attention to, well, the real enabling conditions were, having an occupation force on the ground and having a political alignment of interests with kind of local actors. And when you pulled back and changed that, suddenly, ISIS, which was still kind of a fully functioning bureaucratic organization, was able to metastasize and come back.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay. There are a couple of other questions in there.
Yes, let's see if I can remember them myself. What are the metrics of military effectiveness now? And I mean, if you have any thoughts, I think you must be getting very tired, so we should probably let you wrap up after these two questions. But metrics, and then military organizations, how can they test their effectiveness if they're not in conflict?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the good measures of effectiveness, measures of performance problem, right? One way to kind of parse this strategy versus tactics problem is measures of performance, which tend to be very, very tactical, right? How many targets did you prosecute? How kind of resources did it take? Did you take any casualties along the way? Did you have any kind of targeting errors and civilian casualty incidents, right? Like, those are kind of measures of performance that you can count, and militaries get very, very good at counting things. And I think once those things become articulated and formalized, those are exactly the kinds of things that you can have organizational reforms to go against, right? You've recognized that here is a structured part of the problem. That's part of the problem I need to solve. Now I need to adjust my solution so that it's integrated. But in the process, right, you may then have this divergence between the actual strategic and political effects that you're trying to achieve. So I think in a sense, those measures of effect are always going to be the more difficult and fundamentally contested, aspects of this. And part of that is because, politically, there's usually multiple effects that you're trying to achieve at the same time, right? I want to increase my power, my ability to beat the other side. I want to improve my credibility, my ability to, issue believable assurances or believable coercive threats. I want to do so efficiently so that I can, take care of my other domestic political, initiatives. I want to minimize the risk of escalation, right? All of those may be really, really good objectives, but they will, like, point in different directions. So, like, which one of those do you want to be effective against? That's a political question, not an operational question. Yet this whole question of metrics really goes back to saying like, okay, somebody else has defined the mission for me. What do I do, right? I just think we're in this world where the fundamental complexity of operations tends to push us out into the place where you have that just real ambiguity between what you're trying to do and how you're going about doing it. And for me in the book, the kind of the poster child of this was, President Obama getting involved in individual drone targeting decisions. And on the one hand, you're like, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous tactical micromanagement. No, it's not, right? Like this was kind of real concerns about like, what war are we in? Are we allowed to be here? Are we at war against a new organization? Is it the same organization and this individual's in it? So you're having to do all these kind of like, questions about the justification of the war itself, not just the questions about, the use in bello proportionality discrimination. So like I think that's a great example where you're not going to come up with measures of effectiveness at that level.
Yes, I will say that the question of whether we have authorization for the use of military force got more and more stretched.
Yeah.
Because if you read that original authorization, it was about those who were involved in the attacks of September 11th. And we were, by the mid 2010s, we were beginning to be attacking, in some cases, killing people that were 3 years old on September 11th.
Yeah, right.
So, I really do think we were beginning to lose our, the core of what it was we were meant to be doing strategically. Well, Jon, there are plenty of other questions, but we have asked a lot of you. We've asked a lot of questions, and it's been a wonderful presentation. I've really enjoyed it. I could go on talking to you for hours, but we must let you get a rest, and I shouldn't take over advantage of your goodwill. Is there anything else that you want to say to wrap up?
Again, I just want to thank you for having me. I look forward to the time when we're able to do this in person.
That would be great.
Part of the argument of the book is that the more information technology we have, the greater demand there is for face-to-face interaction, right? The military has this term battlefield circulation, which is kind of commanders and staff officers and everybody else kind of going all over the place. And cynically, you could say, oh, this is war tourism, but actually the more kind of functional role that it plays is that there's a lot of face-to-face organizationally embedded knowledge that you just can't get through these video chats or through writing reports or putting together PowerPoint presentations, right? And I think that's true in kind of an academic community as well. So, I look forward to hearing the questions and learning from everybody in person, because
I can't wait. I'm looking forward to that too, Jon. But short of that, I think that you were a wonderful trooper to continue on when things broke down and you used your phone. And I thank you so much for persisting, and thank you for a wonderful, brilliant presentation as well. I look forward to keeping in touch.
Great. Thank you so much, Audrey. Really appreciate it. It was great.
Thank you. And audience, let me just mention that our next event is a conversation with Bruce Schneier. It's on Wednesday, the 3rd of March, 2021, from 11 to 12:30. So it's in the middle of the day. And please note that new date, the 3rd of March, because we actually had to reschedule it. If you had it written down from earlier, it's no longer correct. He needed a reschedule. He'll be talking about data surveillance and internet security. And Bruce Schneier is a public interest technologist fellow at Berkman Center at Harvard and author of a number of best-selling books, including Data and Goliath and Click Here to Kill Everyone. So we'll be talking with Bruce, and I hope you'll come with more of the great questions that you had for Jon. So again, thank you so much, Professor Jon Lindsay. I'm very grateful for this wonderful presentation. Please go out and buy this book, audience. Here it is, Cornell University Press. You'll find it on Amazon. Wonderful book. There's a lot in here that we didn't get to cover, but you're going to want to read on the case studies that Professor Lindsay was touching upon. So again, thank you everyone, and have a wonderful evening. Thanks again, Jon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.